Very good.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ross. In before I was here, I'm sorry, did you decide on an order or shall I decide? Yes, exactly. Shall I decide for you? Who wants to go first? We have three wonderful commentators to follow, and I don't want to force you to go first if you're not ready to. But Dan, let's go Dan, Emily, Robin. There we go.
Good morning or afternoon, I suppose, for many who are on the chat here. Thanks for including me. I'm actually deeply happy to be able to take part. I wish we could do it in person. So I'm not actually sure when I first met Ross. I know it was pre-COVID, which means it's a bit blurry. Could have been 2 years ago. It could have been 10 years ago. I actually have no idea. But I recall realizing pretty quickly that Ross is the kind of political theorist who I tend to wind up becoming close friends with. He's got a good sense of humor and he's kind, much like one of our other panelists today, my friend Emily Nakol from the University of Toronto. And in fact, and Ross may not remember this, but once in a pub in Exeter during one of my visits to England, Ross related to me a saying that I've actually repeated to many people since then. Academia is filled with smart people, so distinguish yourself by being kind. Now, Ross has, of course, distinguished himself not simply by being kind or funny, but also by his fine scholarship, which we have the joy of discussing today. That he wrote a book about humor is, of course, surprising to anyone who knows him, because, as we all know, Ross is a deeply dour person. And of course, I can see his face, and I made that joke, and I did it verbally, and I'll talk about why I did that in a bit. Before turning to the book, though, I just want to say two things about Ross that do make him unique among political theorists, as far as I'm concerned. First, Ross is the only political theorist with whom I have gone trick-or-treating. I was Captain Kirk, and he was Mr. Spock. Second, Ross is the only political theorist with whom I have observed a stampede of sheep in the English countryside. So all of this is to say, I am deeply happy to join today, and it's gratifying for us all to come together and celebrate, which I think is truly an excellent book. So with an introduction like that, I'll now harshly criticize Ross's book. Of course I won't. I was being sarcastic. That is a form of humor. But in making that comment, and then in the earlier, joke I made about Ross not having a sense of humor, of course he does. I hope to have introduced an important theme of Ross's insightful work. Humor can be unsettling, and depending on the sort, the venue, and the audience, it can be hurtful or dangerous, right? For humor not to be unsettling, or not to be uncivil, a lot of things need to happen. But humor is also, as Ross shows, deeply important in how we think about our shared political life and experience. Now, I should say at the beginning that I was actually pretty well persuaded by Ross's argument, given just how much evidence he marshals of so many sorts, and which I must say is just frankly beautifully woven together into a fine narrative. I mean, this is actually a book that I thought was a pleasure to read and beautifully written. The portrait Ross develops of 17th and 18th century British thought on humor, and in particular ridicule, is that it is limiting to view ridicule as an uncivil per se, just as it is limiting to view it as, quote, page 17, the friend of virtue and the scourge of vice. I was struck by, and frankly, because I'm something of a Mandeville fan, how deeply democratic Ross's Mandeville is. Those who are mocked today will mock others tomorrow, and contempt need not always stick. That's page 84. I appreciate the nuance of Ross's argument, the sensitivity to multiple forms of evidence. Not all of what he engages is a treatise or even a strictly philosophical text. And I was also very much appreciative of the attention he pays to the social positions and positioning of the figures he engages. So, for example, Ross's Hobbes is much more nuanced when it comes to laughter than he's often made out to be. And Wollstonecraft's seeming hypocrisy when it comes to ridicule, frankly, of ridiculing the ridiculous Edmund Burke, shows itself to be much more interesting and sophisticated through a very deep engagement with her biography and her other writings. So really what I want to do in the remainder of my time is focus not so much on the book as a sort of critique, but an exploration of what, if anything, travels from the 18th century to the present. And I'll sort of be thinking about political humor with Ross, hopefully laughing together, and not so much seeking to critique the project per se. But I want to begin with what Ross says about Hume, about whom Adam Smith relates. This is on page 86, quoting Ross. Even those on the receiving end experience Hume's humor, his jibes, as benign. It never was the meaning of his raillery to mortify. Far from offending, it seldom failed to please and delight. Or take the story of Socrates, related by Xenophon. This is on pages 36 to 37 of the book. Socrates is confronted by Apollodorus, who's very upset that he's going to die unjustly. And Socrates says, "Would you rather see me put to death justly?" That's pretty funny. That's the kind of humor I personally actually like quite a lot. But in both of these examples, I think the joking is spoken. Now, that's clearly the case in Socrates. Xenophon is relating what was said. And given the way in which Smith describes the situation of Hume mocking and people taking it in the right way, and there's a sort of simultaneity in the description, it seems to me that Smith is probably also talking there about spoken humor. Now, it seems to me that when we're thinking about ridicule or humor more broadly in politics and ethics, the medium actually matters quite a lot. Take, for example, what Adam Smith says about style in the lectures on rhetoric and belles lettres, specifically lecture 11. At the beginning of the lecture, Smith is discussing the ways in which he says the rules and criticisms of morality are basically just common sense. And he remarks, what makes a man agreeable company is when his sentiments appear to be naturally expressed, when the passion or affection is properly conveyed, when their thoughts are so agreeable and natural, we find ourselves inclined to give our assent to them. With respect to communicative style, he then adds that the author engaged in proper expression never seems to act out of character, but speaks in a manner not only suitable to the subject, but to the character he naturally inclines to. So he's talking about speech, I think, spoken language. Now, a short while later, when he's in the process of ridiculing the Earl of Shaftesbury, this is where he says that Hobbes is hilarious and Shaftesbury, try as he might, he can't make anybody laugh. He makes what's always struck me as a really interesting point about character, style, and behavior. Smith says, the writer may review and correct anything that is not suitable to the character he desires to maintain. But in common life, many accidents would occur which would be apt to cause him to lose his assumed character. And if they are not immediately catched, there is no remedy. So what I take Smith to be saying there is that it's easier to make pretense in a written form than it is in a verbal form. I can always go back and edit a text, but a performance is a make or break situation a lot of the time. But the comment, I think, has another interesting implication for thinking about Hume or Socrates or humor more broadly. It seems to me that verbal humor has dimensions to it that make it fundamentally different from, and potentially an interesting test case for Ross's overall argument. One thing of note in this regard is down on page 123 with Campbell's discussion of eloquence and conversation. It really seems to be spoken language, just as, for example, Cicero reflects on the decorous way of conducting conversation in Book 1 of On Duties. But in the book, not all instances of the use of the term conversation seem to involve what we're doing now, which is talking to each other more or less face to face. So why do I think that this is interesting theoretically and politically, and is an interesting way of thinking about Ross's argument? First and foremost, I can very readily, or I hope fairly readily at least, make clear my intent when I engage in verbal joking much more than I can in written joking. I can modulate my voice, I can gesture, I can wink. Of course, winking has multiple meanings that are culturally contingent. And so forth. It's a lot harder to do with prose, right? There were people who thought that Swift really wanted to have Irish babies be eaten. There are people who thought that Shaftesbury really was trying to undermine all religion per se in the letter on enthusiasm. Now, maybe if Shaftesbury were on Twitter, he could use an emoji, or if he was doing email, he could use a smiley face or some such thing. But I find that written language just it raises a lot of ambiguities that, at least in certain settings with spoken language, are easier to navigate. Although I would add that the experience of lecturing with a mask on changes things fundamentally. I can't see my students' faces and they can't see if I'm smiling. Yesterday, I was lecturing on Hobbes. I perform as if I am Hobbes, so I'm taking a good Erastian stance, saying that the state should supervise the church, and they were mortified, right? And, you know, if I didn't have the mask on, they would know that I'm not being entirely serious. I'm not an Erastian. Second, the cases that in the book seem to work pretty smoothly, Socrates' joke, Hume's teasing, are spoken. Is there something about, and here my love of Adam Smith comes through, is there something about seeing the face and the body that makes spoken language different from written language, be it poetry or prose? Is it the speaker's agency? Is it the interaction between speaker and audience that we should look to gauge the balance between the uncivil and civil? I mean, to me, it's kairotic. It's a classic rhetorical situation. Third, given that when we encounter ridicule, we encounter more forms, I would suggest, of shared public ridicule that is spoken than would have been possible in the 17th and 18th century, right? Or I'll just say that as just a beginning point. Now, there are interesting test cases. There's the libel plays of Jacobean or Elizabethan England, which are performed and people get in trouble for the performance. There's the mocking puppet shows that you discuss in the book where they're making fun of the Huguenots. But it would not have been technologically feasible to have, let's say, the equivalent of Stephen Colbert ridiculing George Bush to his face at the 2006 White House Correspondents' Dinner in 17th or 18th century Britain. Let's say somebody decided at the end of a court mask that they were going to roast James I. If we heard about it, and if the person lived, we'd hear about it in print form, right? Now, does the medium in which we tend to encounter ridicule matter to how we think about it? Fourth, the examples again of Hume in conversation or Socrates in jail, and Ross alluded to this even in his opening comments, these are in private settings. So at the risk of my inner Hobbesian coming out, it seems to me that teasing or ridiculing that I might do in a small group, I don't know how many participants, 34, and I sort of winked and smiled as I made a little joke about Ross there. And I made clear I know him, I'm establishing all these things about my ethos. Doing that in a small group is different from what I do in a large group, right? In fact, I talked with my students about this last week as I role-played Hobbes. And I made clear to them, well, I might gently tease them from, for example, being from Minnesota, which if you're from Wisconsin, I mean, this is just what we do, or Iowa. I would never target an ascribed trait, right? That's cruelty, it's humiliating. Why is that the case? When there's an audience, ridicule works differently, I think. Why? I think in that moment, it's precisely the Hobbesian, the cause of quarrel, glory. Hobbes says we fight for trifles. One-on-one, small group is one thing. You tweet that out, you put that in the broadsheet, and I think it fundamentally can alter the dynamic. So that's just to say, I probably am a little more sympathetic to the uncivil Hobbesian side of things than perhaps Ross is, but we can chat about that. And I maybe got 1 minute or so left. Is that okay, Sarah? Okay. A bit about humor itself. What's funny, cruel, acceptable, unacceptable is socially, politically constructed, not always consciously. And Ross talks about that in the book. But it also seems to me that humor is culturally bound both cross-temporally and cross-geographically and intratemporally and intra-geographically. What do I mean? I find the show Curb Your Enthusiasm to be hilarious. To me, it is like spending time with my own family. I have friends of different ethnic backgrounds who find it to be horrifying and deeply uncomfortable. Okay. Now, take what the linguist John McWhorter said. He remarked this at a talk some time ago at UW-Madison. This is before he decided that our campus would be his key example of the woke mob gone awry. Anyway, so this is what McWhorter remarked. He says that swear words, which at least in American English were quite taboo in, let's say, the 60s or 70s, the F word, for example, are much less taboo today. And words that would have been used quite commonly, derogatory humor, in the 60s or 70s are taboo today. So it seems to me that part of what makes humor so powerful as a political tool, and frankly so hard to theorize, is that what counts as funny, who gets to make particular sorts of jokes, what kind of ridicule is or isn't deeply hurtful, can change so much over time and so quickly. Think, for example, of the classic film Breakfast at Tiffany's. I'm sorry to say the depiction of the neighbor upstairs is deeply offensive. It's deeply offensive, right? Or watch any John Hughes movie from the 1980s in which there is an Asian American character. It is deeply offensive, right? Now, I'm not saying, of course, Ross would endorse those kinds of jokes, but it does seem to me that at the end, Ross suggests that widespread ridicule might be a sign of concern in democracy. And I think that's partially true. But I would also suggest that we need to think a lot about who gets to do the ridiculing and who's being ridiculed. To me, ridiculing the powerful, because frankly, I think someone like Ted Cruz is ridiculous, is vastly preferable and vastly more healthy than other forms of ridicule. Now, that's just a thought or observation. I don't intend that as a criticism. Like I said, Ross's book prompted me to sort of think with it about humor and political humor. One thing I will say that I found really impressive about Ross as a writer and scholar is how sympathetically and warmly he engages his sources, to the point that 17th and 18th century jokes actually are funny as Ross relates them. Ross can even make someone who I find as deeply unfunny, I'm sorry to say, as Shaftesbury, at least moderately less unfunny. But in all seriousness, I think this is a really very, very good book. I think it's an important book, and I'm very glad to have shared thoughts with you all today. And thank you all for your indulgence as I went a couple minutes over.
Thank you. That was wonderful, Dan. That was absolutely fabulous and so thoughtful. And I know Ross wants desperately to respond to everything that you said, but he's not allowed to, unfortunately.